Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in today for this week's webinar exploring business issues related to the coronavirus pandemic. The theme for today's discussion is Canada's next move. What happens after the pandemic? The question everybody wants to know the answer to. Today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist at Smith School of Business, which is at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to remind you, as I always do, that this discussion will be recorded. All of those of you who have registered for this webinar will be receiving that recording by email within a couple of days. And if you want to ask a question, as I say every week, we hope that you will ask questions. It makes the conversation so much richer. You do ask a question by just tapping on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to ask questions at any point, and we will get those questions to our panelists in the second half of the discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. I should tell you that all of our panelists have very impressive CVs, and so this is just a very brief touch of what they have accomplished in their lives, but here we go. David Detomasi is an associate professor of international business and strategy at Smith School of Business. His research interests include globalization, corporate and nonprofit governance, and corporate strategy. He's published widely and is also a frequent media commentator. David has served as an academic director for both the Global Business and Fundamentals of Governance programs at Queen's Executive Education. He holds a PhD from the Department of Political Studies at Queen's and a Master of Arts in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada. Margaret Biggs is the Matthews Fellow in Global Public Policy at Queen's University, where she is also the Massey College Graham Center Visiting Fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy Affairs. She is chair of the International Development Research Center's Board of Governors, chair of World University Services Canada, and a member of the Advisory Council for FinDev Canada, which supports the growth and sustainability of businesses in developing markets. From 2008 to 2013, she was president of the Canadian International Development Agency, also known as CIDA, and previously served as deputy secretary to the cabinet in the Privy Council office. The Honorable Hugh Segal is the Donald Matthews Fellow in Global Public Policy with the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University and a senior strategic advisor to the Aird and Burles law firm. He's a former chair of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee and the Special Senate Committee on Anti-Terrorism. Hugh Segal has also served as Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Associate Cabinet Secretary for Federal Provincial Relations in Ontario under Premier William Davis, and is president of the Institute for Research on Public Policy in Montreal. My goodness, you see what I mean? I mean, that's a mouthful. You guys we're really lucky to have you here. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. So where to start? What I would love to know, just getting into it, is looking at where we're at. We've been at this now. Canada has sort of dug into the coronavirus now. What are we at? 6 weeks? We've really been in this sort of, it's here. I'm just going to throw it out to you, David. I'm going to start with you. What stood out for you so far as you've been watching things unfold?
Well, there's three main things I would like to talk about. One is that after the initial shock happened, we saw some reemergence of some values and characteristics that we had long thought dormant. One of them was resilience. After the initial shock wore off, what I see is businesses, companies, universities have by and large gotten on with what they've had to get on with and have figured out ways to do things that they didn't know how to do before. The second one I like to see is the reaffirmation of strong, rational, science-based public policy on how you deal with something like this, and the role that sound science can play in knowing how to handle something that we hadn't seen in a lifetime, and a reliance on that to know how to manage it. And the third one, in this highly individualized age that I see, is a reassertion and reinvigoration of this idea of community, that we are in this together, that people have others they can look out for, not only in their families, but in their communities. And by and large, they seem to be doing that and pitching in as much as they can. So a lot of these things we have been talking about publicly a lot. I think they've been given a much welcome jolt in all of this.
Okay, amazing place to start. There's so many things to dig into right away, but I want to go to Margaret next and let us know what you've been sort of paying attention to.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll echo a few of the things that David said, but three big headlines off the top. One would be, and it sounds kind of trite, but just the scale, the speed, the scope of the crisis, and how unprecedented it is, and how we're in uncharted waters. There's really no playbook for business or for government, and so I think that's something to keep in mind. Secondly, I'm personally very impressed with how Canada has responded, and I know there's going to be lots of talk, and there is lots of talk about whether we could have done better, we should have been more ready, and that will go on. But overall, I think our public leaders have stepped up. I think governments have responded incredibly quickly and with innovation to get money, to keep people and businesses solvent. I think that federalism has worked. You know, I think we've seen, you know, all levels, all orders of government and levels of government stepping up and, you know, working to their strengths. And finally, maybe on David's point, I think that citizens have shown, Canadians have shown a level of compassion and social solidarity and community that bodes well, I think, for where we go from here. Finally, though, my third point, though, would be, I think my third big takeaway is that this crisis has exposed some really inconvenient truths about existing inequalities in our society, about, you know, precarious and irregular work, and often in very essential sectors. And I think, and how we've underinvested in certain areas of public services that actually we all end up caring a great deal about.
Okay, amazing. Oh my gosh, there's so many things we need to talk about. But Hugh, before we do, I want to let you have a go at sort of what you've been thinking about, maybe in your case, anything about the way the government has been responding that you've been particularly attuned to.
Yeah, I was really surprised pleasantly by the degree to which the provinces, despite all the stresses and strains between the provinces, which is part of how our federation has operated over the years, quite remarkable how they all really began to work together. There was a level of sharing, consultation between the First Minister and his colleagues right across the country, cooperation between the various different public health officers. If you look at other countries, it's been more difficult for them. And even though we do have a decentralized governing structure, I think there's been a strong sense of let's set aside all of those other things and focus on what really matters, which is the public interest and the health of the population. The other thing, which I was really knocked out by, and I say this having been on occasion critical of bureaucracies and civil service structures in the past, how quickly and effectively our public servants, particularly in the Canada Revenue Agency, which by definition is not an agency that people love because of its job of collecting money from all of us on a regular basis, but how quickly they responded to the government's realization that the old income security systems that we've had since the 60s are pretty creaky, can't respond quickly, and CRA was given the chance to do that, and they did it. And they did it remarkably well. So I think that's a discovery which probably bodes well for the future. And the final thing I'd say, and I'm just saying this as someone, as we all over our lives have had, we've had engagements with the medical system one way or the other, the rapid institutional change that our healthcare system, our hospitals and our clinics put into place very, very quickly, so as to produce surge capacity across the country, to ensure that they had the right staff in the right places. I think it was remarkable. I think it's the Daniel Martin, who is the academic head and senior medical officer at Women's College, said she saw changes in a period of days that she thought would take years to achieve, in terms of the use of virtual health and a whole bunch of other things, all of which I think bodes well for not only the resilience point that was made by David and Margaret's point with respect to the public servants stepping up, but it actually speaks to our capacity to be nimble and to make changes quickly when it's in the public interest to do so. So that's very encouraging going forward.
Well, I mean, crises like this can in fact reshape countries, our governments, certainly. I mean, what you've all talked about, you're impressed, how impressed you are with how quickly things have gone, and how in Margaret's case they've revealed inequalities, but in general we're sort of moving ahead, we're doing pretty well given there's no playbook. How does this shape the country going forward? I mean, this is the question of the webinar. What happens after this? Like, given all the things we've learned in just such a short period.
Well, I would argue that it shapes an agenda for action for the provincial and federal governments and for the business community and for the not-for-profit community. And the agenda is around some holes that we have found and some opportunities that we now understand better. We have a terrible hole in terms of actual health data and statistics, which is made worse by the fact that we are a federation. So the health statistics and the way they are calculated in BC may be very different from the way they're done in Prince Edward Island or in Quebec. But if we're going to have a national view, for example, on the issue of community transmission of a disease in a pandemic context, you need apples and apples kinds of numbers so you can actually see what it means. And clearly we are suffering from that gap. It's not a willful thing. It's not because people are going out of their way not to be helpful. It's because the existing systems are different and we have to find a way to rationalize them. And the only other thing that I would say we are going to probably find out, and there's some evidence of it now, is that the people who are most exposed to the risk of the pandemic and the people who are most exposed to health challenges generally in life are the people at the low income part of our population who get sick sooner, generally end up in hospital more quickly, stay in hospital longer because there's nowhere else for them to go, don't have appropriate food and housing. And so that indicates that those expenditures and investments towards those issues are actually a solid investment in our collective health as a community and as a society and our economic well-being. So that's the kind of agenda that emerged after World War II, the Beveridge Report that produced the National Health Service. It's the kind of agenda that produced family allowances after World War II here in Canada. So it's the kind of agenda which I think is constructive and also, of course, suggests that business has a very constructive and creative role to play.
Interesting. Margaret's been nodding a lot this whole time. So I would love you to jump in here.
I agree with everything that Hugh said, and he says it better than anybody. I agree that there's well, I think we have to move out of the emergency response into a recovery, but I think the crisis gives us the opportunity, if not the imperative, to think about some bigger issues, about the kind of society we want and our social contract. And these are the elements that Hugh has noted. And we did that before, after the Depression and the war. We built up a social safety net that proved to be very effective, but it's now out of date in terms of the contemporary structure of our economy and some legacy issues. So I think that's one definite order of business. I think there's other issues though, and then David will get into this more. I think that we have to look at how we move from, it's going to be an asymmetric recovery. Not all sectors are going to bounce back right away. People will look at global supply chains and see how, if we're vulnerable, and whether boards of directors will be looking at the risks posed by some of these supply chains and looking to either shorten them or diversify them, et cetera. And Canada's already indicated that it's going to be screening more in certain sectors in terms of foreign direct investment. So there's going to be some changes on the industrial investment and trade policy front. And I know David can speak to that better than I can. And now he's nodding.
He's nodding, I noticed.
Thanks for the handoff.
He's ready.
So I'm just working for him. Yeah, so if I could, but I think in particular, we're going to have to look, well, this will get into sort of some of the global issues, but I guess I'd like to come back at a certain point to talk about the trade environment. Okay. And how precarious that might be for a country like Canada, which is very much remains a small and open economy. David.
David, take it away.
Okay. Well, a couple of things that I think will reshape the national agenda. The biggest one, I think, is a fairly large wake-up call among Canada and its populace that the world's a risky place. I'll explain on this more later, but we had it pretty good over the past couple of decades. And what has allowed global supply chains to become lean and efficient and all these sorts of things is the risks that were there were either seemed to be minor or easily managed. And we've just found out that they are neither minor nor easily managed. And there's lots of them out there that require an aware and alert government to manage. This is obviously one. People have been talking about pandemics for a long period of time. There's a couple of other really big ones that governments have to pay attention to in terms of ensuring national security for people. One is there's still a lot of nuclear weapons out there that people don't talk about, that we need to be thinking about how we're going to manage that globally. And of course, the biggest lurking one is how are we going to manage climate change? And that is a threat to national security that requires some measure of concern. Thirdly, for companies, I think it's a wake-up call that in order to manage risk, it costs money and it costs awareness, and you have to plan for things that may not happen but are going to be really bad if they do. And it's very easy for CEOs to eliminate that cost in the effort to impress or increase shareholder value, and not give CEOs or others the leeway to say, okay, I'm going to invest in this to ensure I've got backup, even though it's going to cost me some money and I'm not going to be entirely sure I'm ever going to need it, but I might. And there may be some scope for governments to work with businesses to provide them that breathing room to say, I know this may not be the most profitable thing in the world, but it's necessary because you work in an area that touches on the security lives of Canadians. So if you work in that mandate or that idea, then you maybe can cut out that slack to manage risk in a more realistic way.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes, Margaret.
I was just going to ask David a question.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, great.
Cut you off. But so, I mean, a lot of people are asking questions. They already were asking questions about how enterprises factor in issues related to climate risk or security risks. And a pandemic isn't really a black swan, it's a white swan. It was swimming out there. We knew it was going to happen. So what's the role of government in terms of the regulatory function, and what actually should be happening around the board table in companies to think about how better to manage these risks, as in terms of maybe thinking more about the longer term risks and as opposed to sort of some of the short term profit making. I think that's sort of the question that people are asking about, how to reshape, whether you want to call it stakeholder capitalism or whatever it might be, fancy words. How do we get there? David?
For me, well, it depends on the country that you're talking about. I mean, some countries already do this in terms of, in the governance room, already do a lot of societal consultation. They have members of labors on boards of directors and these sorts of things. The American model is much more focused on shareholder return. I think the role of companies, I mean, Hugh can speak to this in a little bit because I know he's involved in boards and other sorts of things. I think one of the things that if you expect a CEO or a senior management team to act in a certain way that includes consideration of what we call ESG, environmental, social, and governance performance, you have to give them incentive to do so and space to do so, right? That if they spend money on something that may cost and should be viewed as an investment, not as an external expense, they will do that, that there is reward systems built in the system so that they get paid and rewarded for doing these sorts of activities. But thirdly, and this is the last thing I'll say before I hand it off to Hugh on this, we can't get too far ahead of the global pack, because if we are asking people to do things and others are not, and can therefore reap a momentary financial gain from not doing these things, and we are, it's a competitive handicap Canadian companies have to face that others don't. That's there's going to be pushback on that. So those are some things, there's a system that has to be in place to reinforce the incentives we want and the behavior you want, but also give the space for people to do it.
Yeah, I agree with both my colleagues. I think one of the interesting questions, let's just take one sliver. A lot of value has been put in the way in which companies manage inventories. And the ability to do so on a just-in-time basis was seen as an impressive efficiency. It allowed things to be manufactured in different parts of the world and then come together to be assembled in other places, but not to have undue inventory costs, which are a dead weight on your balance sheet. I think, though, now, because of this experience, a lot of people will be asking ourselves this question. The resilience that David speaks about is really about what I call, and what the armed forces has always called, strategic redundancy. I remember during the ice storm, when huge parts of Quebec had no electricity and had to move into large auditoriums and schools, etc. The Canadian Forces Base in Trenton actually had from the plans from a nuclear attack of 3 decades earlier, absolute storage areas filled with cots and mattresses that were pristine pure, and they could put them in trucks and they could move them to Quebec so people had a place to sleep. That's called strategic redundancy. And I think as we look at the kind of circumstances we have faced with the equipment necessary and the protective gear necessary to gear up our hospitals and be ready for surge, it's clear that failing to have a strategic capacity, strategic redundancy in some of those things is problematic. The regulatory question, which Margaret raised, is really fascinating. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, ever since 08-09, has audited our financial intermediary, banks and insurance companies and all the rest, to make sure their financial ratios were appropriate, that they had sufficient near cash and cash around to meet all their obligations and promises, even if the economy turned to dust in the handbasket, as it can do. But I think now you're going to see that that is going to be something which is also going to be an audit and regulatory framework for other companies and other kinds of businesses, because having the ability to sustain continuity of business when you have this kind of circumstance is fundamental, not only for the shareholders, but for the other stakeholders, the community in which you operate, your employees, your customers, and all the rest. So that will be part of what I think will be on the agenda for constructive reform going forward. And I think the other thing that we have to remember is that, and it was Bernanke who said this when he helped manage through the Federal Reserve 08-09, liquidity is the absolute essential for getting the economy started again, for getting recovery going at some significant pace. And he did his PhD thesis at MIT on how the initial response to the first awful 1929 collapse was austerity. And you can already hear the drums on the far right here in our country beating for, well, the deficit's so high, we're going to have to cut back expenditures. And trust me, inflation and high deficits, they're not good, but they are way better than deflation and the total collapse of demand. And that is the risk we face if our government loses the scent, which I think so far they do have, of the need to ensure liquidity going forward.
Anyone want to respond? Before I will,
I mean,
you guys, without
there are lots
getting
of things
too,
on the agenda. I got a couple of things.
Yeah.
One is we do know that, and then I'll get to let Margaret in. We do know the companies that are managing this pandemic right now, the ones that are doing better are ones that have some cash
right.
in the bank. And so now, quite often you can view that cash in the bank as a deadweight loss. Why aren't you deploying it in a bank? Why aren't you lending it out? Well, the whole idea of having reserve requirements for banks is to ensure that there is a reserve in case something like this happens, because it's in a bank's interest to loan out as much as they can. I wouldn't be surprised if there might be at least some talk of finding ways to ensure that companies are setting aside some cash if they can. And secondarily, I'd like to echo Hugh's point. We're going to get into this in a little bit later because I'm going to plant it now and I hope we return to it, and that's the issue of debt. Individual, country, and others, how much we are taking on, can we afford this, and how do we pay it off, which you're seeing in the newspapers right now. But I would take on a little bit of debt now to ensure the liquidity that Hugh talks about and keep it there as long as it takes for individuals to recover their consuming mojo and feel comfortable again and get that thing, and then you withdraw. But you do it too soon, as Bernanke said, you risk having it fall back into depression, which makes it much harder to reinvigorate.
So, I mean, because our audience listening are probably business-minded people who want the answer to the question, what happens next? What are the moves? What are we going to be looking for as we try to get the economy moving? What are steps that we can take? Like, how do we know? What are the signals? Is there even an answer to that?
I had one that I would just offer out. I think it's really great we had a recent federal election, because that gives Mr. Trudeau time, and he can follow a more, what I would call, rational, science-based, careful, clear-headed, minded way, working with the provinces to open up the economy in a sustained but manageable way. He doesn't need to cheerlead. He doesn't need to get the economy really firing again in 6 months because he's got to win an election in 8. There is one other individual in the world right now who I think is thinking it differently. And we don't need to cheerlead because, you know, I think people, when you cheerlead, when there's nothing to cheer about, I think people know that. But when you encourage them to spend in a relatively rational way, and then they feel that they're comfortable and they don't backslide, that gives us the time to have a measurable and sustained recovery. That's one I think we have an advantage on, at least federally, because it gives us the time to do this right.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah, Margaret.
I don't have an answer to your the question that everybody wants an answer to, but just to build on what David said and the previous conversation about that Hugh raised about austerity versus well, the issues of inflation and deflation, et cetera. I think it just underscores how well, I was going to use the word precarious, but that sounds scary, but how the synchronization of public policy. Right now we are firing on all fronts in terms of public policy, macroeconomic, microeconomic, social policy, you know, health policy, everything's moving. And so, I mean, I'm not saying anything people don't know, but just to underline that the synchronization of our public health response and our public health protocols and our economic recovery, they go hand in glove. And you can open up the economy, you can open it, but people will not come. People will not feel safe. So finding that sweet spot where, and I do think this is why our leaders are taking so much time and attention to trying to get it right and not over promising. And that at the end of the day is getting that formula right and experimenting and testing, not just testing public health virus testing, but testing how far they can go, will then allow for a more sustainable recovery. And I think that we've never had to do that before, but I think that's key. And then finding the sweet spot between how much liquidity do you put in and when do you start pulling it out? And how do we move from the massive infusion of resources, for example, to workers, when we actually want to start to get them back to work? And then what do we put back in place? We can't run with the CERB, which is the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, forever. We got 7 to 8 million Canadians essentially on the benefit. That isn't sustainable and nor desirable. So how do we migrate off that to get them back to work? But for those who are not going to go back to work right away, because the recovery will be asymmetric, what do we have in place for them, and how can we make sure that that's fit for purpose? So the synchronization issue, I think, is really critical, and I think trying to avoid any false dichotomies between health on the one hand and economic recovery on the other is really key.
Mm-hmm.
Meredith, I would say that the things to look for, I think we need to have, and we're going to probably anticipate a change in the leadership of the Bank of Canada because it's been in the cards for some time, and the existing governor's term is coming to an end. We need to have clarity about quantitative easing. In other words, the commitment of the central bank to provide liquidity necessary for the economy in terms of the money supply, and also in terms of quantitative easing relative to corporate and provincial bonds for a period of time, not forever, but for a period of time to facilitate a transition to a more buoyant economy. I think it'll also be important that government comes forward with as unified and focused an infrastructure investment plan as possible. This was done successfully after the 08-09 credit collapse in the US. I remember at Queen's, we celebrated the opening up of the new health sciences medical building, because the nature of the grant which Queen's had was not only specific to a shovel-ready proposition, but also that it had to be finished within a certain period of time to qualify for all 3 slices of the grant. And that went on across Canada and was a very stimulative and constructive way to get the economy moving in a series of areas. So clarity from government about their intent in that respect, hopefully in a budgetary statement at some point relatively soon, will be of huge, huge value. The only other thing that I would say, and I want to support Margaret, while they don't have to have detailed answers to what the transition will be from the CERB now, I'd like to think there'd be a lessons learned approach taken after the pandemic is deemed to be manageable. and a lessons learned that says, what did we do well? What worked really well? And how can we strengthen that? And what could we have done better? And what could we do better in the future? And that should be something with the provinces and the business community and the labor community. I mean, one of the most significant events, I thought, was the decision of the head of the Canadian Labour Congress to call his colleague, president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and say, we really should be doing our response to pandemic together, not in opposition to each other. And Nassif Hussain went across to Perrin Beatty's office, and they then called the government together. That's the sort of collaborative approach we need. We do have a free market economy, but it's a mixed market economy. We have an economy that is based on public sector and private sector and not-for-profits and crown corporations and a vibrant financial sector. I also think, and this will upset some of our listeners, but viewers, I actually think the government has to talk about a liquidity fund for agriculture and for energy in Western Canada. We basically did that for the car industry when we were going through a difficult time in 08-09. And this is not about taking a value position about fossil fuels or whether we want to keep on raising beef. It's about helping those industries get to where they have to get and having liquidity to do so because of the collapse of demand, which is completely beyond their control or ours. Those are the sorts of things which I think would build confidence and build momentum.
I'd just like to jump in and support Hugh on that last point. I wrote an article, Meredith will know this, on the Queen's Business website, essentially arguing similar things about supporting the Canadian energy industry. For a variety of national interest reasons, I think this is something we should consider. And a lot of people didn't agree with that, but some people did, because this is not of their making. We are a strong energy leader. The world depends on carbon-based energy and will for a few decades yet. So this is not something that we can rapidly change, even if we kind of want to. So that was one point I wanted to echo for Hugh. And I had another one, but it jumped away. It'll come back in a second.
I actually wanted to take a moment. Margaret, earlier in your introduction, you said this pandemic is revealing some inconvenient truths about inequality in Canada. And Hugh, I know that you have some programs, some things on your mind around this in this area, but do you think that what we're looking at is the government having to reimagine its social programs to meet those inequalities, to address those inequalities? Or do you think we'll go back to, oh well, go back to normal? Margaret?
Yes, I think it will, because I think that there will have to be a rethinking on a number of fronts, because it's proven that not only from a social concern, but from an economic resilience point of view, it's important that we actually have social policies that are in sync with the structure of the current economy. So we have an EI system that was built for an industrial economy that no longer exists. So we've patched it up and done lots of little things here and there. But at the end of the day, the coverage is not what it needs to be. There's all kinds of people in the gig economy, so-called, and in other kinds of irregular work that don't qualify. And so they're the ones actually who are most caught out in the current situation. We have things for seniors. We have a very good income security network now for families with children, but there's other big gaps in our income security. So I think it's a time, we know that with the future of work, with the growing automation across various sectors, that the work in the workplace is going to change. And that means that we're going to have to rethink how our income security measures bridge people better than they do right now, and allow them to retrain and reskill to take advantage of where new opportunities are rising. And right now we have both gaps, but also have some kind of crazy disincentives built into our current system. So I think the time is right. What the steps are to get from where we are now to where we might want to get to is really the big question.
I remember what I was going to say.
Right.
And this is important because it plays into what Margaret said and this idea that Hugh talked about and may talk about in a minute. In crisis, you do things you wouldn't normally do, like reach across the aisle to someone who you have political opposition with, or say, we need to collectively address this. The problem is you solve the crisis And then a very natural human tendency is to say, well, we've solved the problem. We can go back to the way things were. That was an aberration, and we don't need to permanently put into law measures to ensure that this doesn't happen again. I mean, we need to capitalize on this moment of where it's very clear we have gaps in the system and that regular electoral politics might prevent an effective solution being put in place. Now you can. And you can put it into regulations in such a way that it maintains beyond the life of this one crisis. Because as soon as it's very surprising how fast people forget. It's one of the challenges of effectively solving a public policy crisis. People say, well, it wasn't so bad, and don't worry about it, and we don't need to do that anymore. And then boom, it happens again.
I know one of the things that, Hugh, maybe you want to touch on this.
Well, only to say this, we have a piece of plumbing in Canada called the Federal Provincial Fiscal Relations Act, which is basically what defines things like equalization and transfer payments, and it's negotiated between Ottawa and the provinces on a regular basis, and then it's backed up by statutory approval in the House of Commons. So we have an opportunity now to say, okay, for those negotiations, based on what we now know about what worked well and what didn't work well, what should the underlying principles for that negotiation be? And that, by definition, allows you to work with the provinces and come to some constructive conclusion going forward about what you need to reform, how you might do it, how it can be done more efficiently and with more humanity and more effectiveness. And look, if we think about universal health insurance, which proved itself one more time in this crisis as a great national strength, it started with the CCF, the New Democrats in Saskatchewan. Mr. Diefenbaker then asked Mr. Justice Emmett Hall to figure out what it meant for Canada. By the time that report came in, Mike Pearson was Prime Minister, and he then negotiated with the provinces to make universal health insurance a national reality, administered by the provinces, but in fact funded ab initio by dollar for dollar support from Ottawa for new health facilities and others that might be necessitated by all of that. Now, there's not a political party in the country that's opposed to universal health insurance. So you don't have to worry about it evaporating, as David is constructively worried about, after an election because some political party replaces another political party. So I think we have to do this as a family, as a federal provincial family, respectfully. But we have to be very clear that we've learned some things from the crisis. And if we don't deal with them effectively, it'll make the next crisis worse and more problematic and more harmful to more people. And that's not the Canadian way.
Whoa, so many things I want to ask you. Questions are coming in from the audience. I do want to make sure, you've left the door wide open for us to talk about ourselves in contrast to our neighbors to the south. Margaret wants to address the trade environment. I want to make sure that we let her get to that and open that part of the conversation. And then I want to get to some questions from the audience. Margaret, do you want to just take it away, or do you need a specific question?
Thanks, Meredith. Well, maybe just to put out there, I think it's one of the other little elephants that's in the room right now is around globalization. And there's a lot of, there's just a lot of, that some people are talking about deglobalization and decoupling the global economy, et cetera. And obviously in some areas, and Hugh and David both spoke to this, there may be a need to create, I think Hugh called it strategic redundancy or some capacity for national production in certain strategic areas. That's a national security issue, but it doesn't mean that's the way we're going to drive the whole economy. But I think there's a huge risk for Canada, given that we are, and it's not just a cute phrase, we are a trading country, we are a small open economy, and our prosperity and productivity depends on open markets. And we've invested a lot in developing trade and investment agreements, both across the Pacific and the Atlantic and elsewhere, and of course with our southern partners. So a concern I have, I think that we all have, is that in the current environment, it's not the same as in the 2008, 2009 during the global financial crisis. The G20 stepped up. We had leadership across the board, including from the United States, about preventing a fall into protectionism, as we'd seen in previous economic crises in the Great Depression. And we don't have that kind of global cooperation and solidarity right now. We don't have the leadership from the United States, and we have everybody turning fairly inward, driven by the fact that they've had to put in export controls and other kinds of measures to protect certain key supplies. So we just don't want that to become the new normal. We want to do what needs to be done, and there will be some rethinking of global supply chains, as David indicated, but ensuring that we don't actually have a global economy that either continues to underperform or that turns inward. And that will not be in Canada's interest. And I think that means that one of the areas that Canada will want to invest in public policy on the global scale will be on the trade policy front.
I'd agree 1,000% with what she has just said. There has been a general trend over the last several decades to embrace globalization and open borders and finance and trade flows across borders. Now, that agenda has never been 100% and has never been universally supported from all sorts of people, and it has created domestic policy problems. You've had rising inequality, you've had industries hollowed out, you've had people whose skills and abilities are no longer relevant. Now, when a crisis hits and these things happen, the knee-jerk automatic reaction of governments is to put up borders. The whole idea of negotiating international trade agreements, international financial agreements, is to give them incentive not to do that when there is a problem, because to do so is to make the whole problem worse. And the proper response, I would argue, to the problems inflicted by an increasingly global economy is not to put up borders and stop the global economy, which would hurt our interests but to find effective domestic policies that can counteract the problems that an increasingly integrated economy creates. We've had 2 or 3 really creative ones expressed today. Basic income supplements, how do you deal with the gig economy? These are domestic policy challenges, but that's where they should be solved. You don't solve it simply by saying, well, I'm just going to shut myself off and the problem will go away. It won't, and you'll be worse off because of it.
I 1,000 times agree with David. Let's not throw the globalization, the global economy baby out with the bathwater. The focus is, we have not, though, taken enough attention to focus on the kinds of social policy infrastructure we need to support that. And there have been people who have suffered as a result.
Right. Hugh.
The only thing I would add, and this is really an area that Margaret is far more expert in than I am, Canada has been, I think, withdrawing under various governments, conservative and liberal, from investing in international development. And I think it's a mistake. It's a mistake for the global economy. It's a mistake for our economy. And, I think of our own neighbors in the Caribbean, Commonwealth brothers and sisters, large and huge linkages to Canada. They're going through an awful time because of the collapse of the tourism industry, and they're all very close to the IMF in terms of debt issues anyway. We can make a huge impact and just send a message. Yes, we're going to deal with our own priorities. They come first, but we have not forgotten that we are part of a larger global community, and particularly in our own neighborhood, we intend to do what we can to make life better for folks who share so much with us. Those are the sorts of things that really set apart countries which make a difference and those which just become internalized and over time quite irrelevant.
Yeah.
It's
a great time to lead for Canada. It's weird in the global trading system that right now you have a full frontal assault on it being launched by the country that by and large built it. All right. And that's a little odd historically. And now we could argue this is just the predilections of one particularly out of character US president, and it may go back. But in the absence of that leadership, there is going to be room for Canada to say, hey, we can own interests first, but we know there's a big world out there we can help. And this is what we're going to do.
Can I just a quick mention to pick up on both those points? Really, well, going back to what Hugh said, we don't tend to think about it. I mean, we will think about it because the global pandemic will have untold hardship and havoc on developing and emerging countries. They don't have the resources to throw at it, both health resources or the liquidity to throw at it. They're affected by the collapse in tourism, by the drop in remittances, and on it goes. So the transmission chain, both in health side and economic and financial side, is going to be horrendous. And so that there's a human cost to that, and I think Canadians care about that. But also, it is not in our interest to have developing and emerging economies go backwards. They are a source of global growth and productivity, and it's in our interest to ensure that they can both survive and thrive through this crisis. So, and we can start in our neighborhood in the Caribbean, but across the developing world, there's going to be a need. And this is what the kind of thing that the G20 was quite effective with, during the 2008-2009 crisis. And we don't have that current mechanism right now, or well, at least functioning and robust right now. So.
Right. I'm getting so many questions from the audience. I'd like to throw one out at you, which sort of relates regarding global supply chains, and whether you imagine, any of you who want to speak to this, a shift with our global supply chains coming out of this crisis, and how you think Canada will be affected. Someone has asked, will it affect our supply relationship with China, for example? Any thoughts?
So I'll argue that it will affect, in some commodities, some of our relationships. And we'll have to do a bit more in what we call safe producing countries and in our own jurisdiction, but it need not go across the board. And in fact, we should be very careful not to encourage the massive alteration of supply chains generally, once we've dealt with our strategic requirements on an effective basis.
Anyone else?
I would argue, yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One is the devil's in the details. I mean, a supply chain for an electronics company looks very different than a supply chain for an agricultural company or pharmaceutical country. So to say we should just stop a supply chain from country X doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense. It depends. A classic academic answer. Secondarily, we may find that if we are pulling back from one particular supplier, we may find really effective places elsewhere that were sources of talent, skills, and abilities and attributes that we didn't know were there. And perhaps now we do. You know, we can say, okay, well, maybe we should think about doing something different. Thirdly, there may be some repatriation, but on a cost-effective basis of some things. But at the end of the day, the amount of gain a globally integrated economy has put in place with the necessary safeguards perhaps built in, you know, the evidence that it's really helpful for pretty much everybody in terms of raising income levels, raising overall health levels, lowering violence, all kinds of other things is overwhelming. So we've got a pretty good baby here to keep. So, you know, I think we will keep doing it, maybe with a bit more careful eye, but it's still there.
Okay. To the topic of money, David, earlier you talked about the question of debt and how much we can afford. Somebody has written in to ask, how are we going to pay for all this government spending that we're anticipating or that we're seeing now? Will there be new taxes or will there be program cuts? Are those the only two options?
Well, I think for what it's worth that there'll be two approaches. First of all, just so we're clear, the amount of money that we have borrowed will not be anywhere near what we borrowed in relative terms as a percentage of our economy, GDP, during World War II. And that did get managed over time in a responsible way. There'll be two ways to manage it. One will be focusing on economic growth. As the economy grows and as the percentage of debt as a part of the GDP reduces, then our ability to move ahead is not constrained. In fact, it's enhanced. And strategic investment at a time in debt when interest rates are as low as they are is in fact the right thing to be doing. And the opposite, which is not getting the liquidity you need to facilitate recovery, is a mistake. And I don't think that if we're having this same conference in 5 years' time, there'll be much concern about the size of either the Canadian debt or the actual deficit.
Okay. Anyone else?
I'll add a couple of things to that. One is the ability of developed markets to hold and withstand increasing debt levels is far greater than most people ever thought. We've been talking about the U.S. deficit and accumulated debt and deficit expenditures for decades now. And people keep saying, well, sooner or later, you know, there's going to be, someone's going to call a tune on this and stop loaning the money, and nobody ever does. Largely because there's lack of alternatives, but also because generally people have a faith in the global US economy, and it's a big, vibrant, powerful economy. And if it grows, debt servicing actually goes lower over time, and it's much more affordable than people tend to think. I do think we do need a national conversation about debt, and I think it's not just a Canadian issue. And that is this idea we can grow enough to pay for it. Certainly we hope so. But secondarily, what is that debt being used for? If it's used for the types of productivity enhancing investments that Hugh was talking about, then it's going to pay for itself because we're going to gain a more productive economy out of it. If it's being used to pay for promises that where the actuary tables were wrong and they're very expensive and we don't know where they're actually adding value to make that economy grow, are they affordable? Now that's a very difficult question to take. It's the classic third rail problem in politics, but we are more resilient in handling more debt than people often think. Countries can handle more of it. They have options that individuals don't. But the looming figure does bother people, and they certainly want it to be talked about and addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just add?
Yeah, please do.
I agree with everything that Hugh and David said. I just wanted to underscore a couple points. One is, it's not that the money right now is free, but interest rates are so low that the numbers sound scarier than they actually are. I think the bigger issue is how, what the level of ongoing deficit would be, and how we sustain those over time, because that's what will begin to accumulate. And what the public spending's for. I think there's universal acceptance or agreement on the part of economists that just spending the money now for liquidity is exactly the right thing to do. But as we move out of the crisis and into the recovery, the investments the expenditures have to be investments. They have to, as David said, they have to bear dividends. We have to be investing in the competitiveness and productivity of the economy and the skills of our workers, and those kinds of investments will pay off. Or the kind of infrastructure program that Hugh rightly pointed to that was very effective and moved out very quickly after the crisis in 2008, 2009, building critical infrastructure, again, that's going to help fuel the economy. So it's not the amount we spend, it's what we spend it on, and also looking over time.
So then this question has just come in. What do you believe is Canada's stimulus capability if there is a second wave requiring more handouts to support the economy?
Well, I think any fiscal plan that the Minister of Finance would share with the country at some point in the next month will have to deal with our capacity to address that kind of challenge going forward. If we address some of the core issues around streamlining our income security system, that will actually free up some cash to be deployed in emergency contexts, and we may have a better infrastructure to deal with that problem if there is a second wave than we did before this one started and all the scrambling had to take place to create instant programs to address the liquidity crisis. So it's like everything else, the better you build for the future, the more the roof can withstand another tough storm.
All right.
If there is, and I'm not a medical person, I don't know, but most seem to think there is going to be a second wave. But we'll have several months of getting our PPE all together, knowing the processes in hospitals, knowing what to do if it happens, isolating, testing. I would argue that a second wave that broke out in 4 or 5 months would be, okay, we expected this, here it is, and we're going to deal with it, and it won't have the shock effect. And secondarily, I think as I talked about earlier, government's ability to borrow at low interest rates right now is very powerful, and they can withstand more debt than is commonly assumed. And so the broader danger of having the economy tank is a bigger one than worrying about debt. I mean, you have to keep an eye on it, but right now the liquidity function's more immediate.
Okay. I have so many questions, and some of them are quite specific. Margaret, I'm going to toss this one to you and see if it's of interest. What kind of impact do you see from coronavirus around the role of international agencies, such as the WHO? Will their role evolve or change significantly? It's a little bit off topic, but interesting nonetheless.
Very topical, great question. Well, without getting into all of the current controversy about the WHO, I will make one general point. I mean, I think most people in the field of public health and global health would argue and have argued that the WHO is absolutely critical to the global community's ability to fight this pandemic. They may not do everything perfectly right, but I think, in fact, rather than beating on them, it's an example of how the kind of global cooperation that's absolutely critical, not just to our health and well-being, but also to the restarting of our economy. So I think that it sort of goes back to our deglobalization or decoupling comment that we talked about before. And I may be biased, I personally think that this crisis on both the economic and the health front shows us the importance of international cooperation. And these institutions are only as strong as we make them. So you can beat on the WHO all you want, but it's like it basically is in service of the nation states that comprise it. It doesn't have any sovereign powers or armies that can go in. So if we build them up and make them strong, then they can serve us and everybody. So that's my answer to this is that I think that these institutions I'm not saying they're all perfect, and that each of them is equally effective in terms of what they do. But I think that it's shown the importance of these global institutions to our economic and social success.
Okay. Another question from the audience. What specific steps should corporate boards be taking, and what signals should boards be looking for in the economy to activate those steps? So what specific steps should corporate boards be taking, and then, yeah, signals from the economy?
Well, I'll start. I think all of the corporate boards, publicly traded companies, have had a pretty good exposure to the core issues of continuity of business as produced by the pandemic. And some were better prepared than others. And the marketplace sort of understands who has done better in that respect and who has not. So I think one of the questions that every board should be reflecting on, what do we now know about the challenge of continuity of business that we didn't know before the pandemic? And how can we improve, better plan, better coordinate, maintain the strategic capacity, investment, and cash flow necessary in the future to be able to deal with whatever the next shock might be? And what is the right allocation of resources, which is always the core question in a publicly traded company, to achieve that goal? And I think that's a legitimate question. And then I think people like the Securities Commission and others who audit for things like ESG and other important things may begin to ask questions about that particular part of how a public company operates, not because public companies have failed to perform, quite the contrary. I think Canadian companies have done very well, but because there'll be an expectation that we have clarity about how that should proceed in the future, and we should be able to actually generate the answers to that as a consistent part of normal due diligence.
Right.
Yeah, I got a couple of additional things. All those things that Hugh said obviously are quite powerful. One of the things I think boards should be doing is, to analyze, you have to continuity of business, conserve cash, make sure we get through this, but then to take a really hard look about what is it that we really did well, and what is it that we don't do perhaps well. But there are some things, leadership issues, cultural issues that show whether or not we are able to withstand this if it happens again. And if we have positive things, how do we ensure that the corporate culture continues to emphasize those things when the memory of this particular period fades? That we really invest in our people. Quick example is investment in people worker training. The first thing that people cut when there's need to conserve cash often is the amount of money you can spend on or worker training, upgrade educations, things of this nature. When these are viewed as investments or viewed as expenses when they should be kind of viewed as expenses. And identifying core things one should be doing, even though right now it may cost a little extra money, or this is key to what we need to continue to do, therefore we're going to keep doing it, even though it may cost us some money at the moment. I think that's something boards ought to at least be thinking about, if not outright doing.
I've just noticed the time. We are 2 minutes to the end, and I do want to give each of you a chance to say something hopeful for our audience. In fact, it is a question that has come in, and I think that given we have 1 minute to wrap things up, so we must keep this short. But the question is, what do you hope to see? What do you hope to see to be the single major change that we'll see as a result of this crisis, either in actions of the government, public health, trade, or at the consumer level? It's a little bit of a free-for-all. What is the single major change that you think we will be seeing? And let's keep it in a positive vein and leave our audience feeling the hope that they need to get on with this day.
I think the Canadian public will be impressed with how nimble our government was in dealing with liquidity issues, and they're going to expect that same nimble approach in how we deal with structural issues going forward. They're encouraged by what they saw, but they're going to want more of it, not less.
Okay, thank you. Margaret or David,
Margaret, go ahead.
one of you.
All right, I'll do mine.
Okay.
One of the things is the great irony. Mrs. Steven Pinker makes this argument in The Better Angels of Our Nature. We are living in the most successful, safest, most economically powerful time in human history, and mental health problems are gone through the roof, depression problems, people are worried. One of the things I would like people to take out of this is that they are tougher and more resilient than they thought they were, and have more confidence, not just in their governments and in their companies, but in themselves. You know, you withstood this. Maybe it's time to write that book or start that business or do something, because you can, and there's great opportunity to do it. And we need you to, because if we do, we're going to come out of this way better. So get after it.
You're talking about a societal shift of thinking then. I like that. Margaret.
Yeah, I would go in the same direction, maybe a little bit different. I think that what we've already seen and what I hope is sustained is that sense of social solidarity in our society, and that we'll keep asking ourselves what kind of society we want, and what kind of human values we want to bring to our economy and to our society. And I think that. And then I'm hopeful that there will be different kinds of imperatives around how markets will react to these issues around risk and resilience, and that we'll begin to see behavior change across the board.
Well, I feel better already. Thank you. I do have to take a moment before we wrap things up to promote our Queen's Executive Education's remote learning programs. I do this every week, so audience, bear with me. But we do have 2 remote learning programs coming up this spring: Strategic Planning and Leading Change, which is May 12th and 13th, followed by our 4-day executive education program, 4-day executive execution program, which runs from June 8th to 11th. So for more information, you can visit the URL you see on your screen, smithqueens.com/execed. We have lots of different kinds of programs, custom programming designed to delivered to meet your organization's specific needs. So do check out that website and let us know how we can help. I do hope that everyone enjoyed today's webinar. I do want to let you know that next week we'll be hearing from Professor Catherine Broman, and her presentation is called Executing in Uncertain Times: How to Remove Barriers and Reach Your Organization's Goals Successfully. So that's next Thursday, May the 7th at 1 p.m. And the sign-up details will be posted on Smith Business Insight, but you'll also be invited to attend by email, and I hope you will. So in closing, I do want to thank David, Margaret, Hugh, all of you. What wonderful insights, what amazing conversation. I'm sure we could have done another whole hour of this and you would not have run out of things to say. So we're really grateful to have you in our community and to have you share what you know with us today. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Meredith.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.
Enjoy the afternoon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.